Hi, everyone. I think we should go straight to the other panel for the sake of time. So if I can call our panelists here, and I'll take this time actually to do an introduction. So we have here with us Stephen Bellovin, who's a professor of computer science at Columbia School of Engineering. Hi, how are you? And we have also Professor Anupam Chander, who's a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center. We have Valerie, who's the co-founder and VP at Digital Equity. And we also have Aubra Anthony. Thanks for being with us. She's team lead for USAID Strategy and Research. And we have Katie Chander, who's a professor, Highet, who's a lead for FinEquity's technology working group at CGAP. So thank you for being with us as well. My name is Ronaldo Lemos. As John mentioned, I'm a visiting professor here where I teach technology policy, especially for the developing world. So I would like to start this conversation just by saying that governments, and I'm not sure if you agree with me, will have a very hard task to transition into digital platforms. They cannot afford not to do so. If a government doesn't become a digital platform, most likely it will lose the capacity to govern. Problem is, this transition can be planned, like Estonia did. We all heard from Thomas earlier this afternoon. Estonia had a plan, and it basically put that plan into action, and it turned the government of Estonia in probably one of the most advanced digital governments we have. However, for the developing world, this transition might actually be completely accidental. So no plan whatsoever. You will be doing that in patches. Maybe the private sector will come up with certain solutions that will be adopted and will be integrated without much thinking about the consequences and so on. So this panel is for us to discuss digital IDs, because if governments will transition into digital platforms, digital IDs will most likely be the login into those platforms. So this is one of the issues that we are going to be discussing today. And of course, issues like data ownership, privacy, surveillance. Do we need digital IDs? All these questions, I think, are up for grabs in this particular panel. So let me start first with Aubra. And I would love to hear from you about your experience in this field, and basically, how do you address some of these questions that I raised?
Sure, happy to. So, as Ronaldo said, I work at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we work across a number of different countries, and we do programming across multiple sectors. So we work on resilience, we work on food security, global health, democracy, and governance. My team, the strategy and research team, sits in a smaller kind of think tanky space where we look at the role of digital technologies across the work that we do, both assisting governments and working with private sector partners and NGOs in country to do this different kind of sectoral work. And my team has researched the role of different digital technologies in this broad space that we work in, specifically looking at digital identity. And so a lot of the work that we do relies on the need to identify individuals. So if you're doing case management, or if you're working to get cash assistance to refugees in need, you need to be able to identify that individual who's on the other end of services or receiving goods and services. We also work with governments as they are working to stand up voter registration systems. And so increasingly, we see digital identity being a key component to all of the different work that we do. And so as my team has researched the role of digital identity in the different sectors in which we work, we've looked and kind of tried to landscape the broad universe of how we interact with this and how this affects the country's development. And so over the course of a couple of years and looking across the different ways we make investments, we see that if we're not approaching this with a mindset of long-term self-reliance and growth, we end up contributing to a fragmented digital ID landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be very careful in investing in systems that are locked into specific vendors, that don't foster interoperability, because ultimately that undermines a country's ability to continue to develop. And so what we've done as a team, and also throughout the agency, is try to work with across multiple sectors and with different partners to foster a greater sense of building the foundational components of identity systems. When we are making these types of investments, how can we structure them in a way that they're contributing to the longer-term growth of countries? How can we identify what's in place in country and try and meet the landscape or the ecosystem where it is and strengthen the existing ecosystem rather than creating systems that are going to be operating in parallel or in silos and ultimately undermining the growth of those in-country systems. So that's the kind of nice narrative about how we build stronger IT systems. The flip side to that is that when we're working in countries where governments may not have the ability to protect private information about individuals, we ultimately could be putting people at risk if we're pushing toward greater integration of systems, greater interoperability. And so there's kind of a double-edged sword of acting in this space, working to promote the use of foundational identity systems in a digital age, while also ensuring that we are walking away from the digitization of these systems when privacy or security is being put at risk. And this is increasingly an issue when you're working in places with an authoritarian influence. So I think there's a number of things that we'll talk about on this panel that hit on some of those things, but I think it's important to remember that it's not actually, ID is an issue that is being frequently discussed across all of the countries in which USAID is working. This is something where some countries are far ahead of where the US is in this space, that actually have strong foundational digital identification systems versus a functional driver's license type system, different types of functional systems that we rely on as foundational. And I think, as we work to create the types of growth that are going to lead to inclusive systems and sustainable use of these systems, it's incredibly important that we think about not only the technical interoperability of systems, the way that we can crowd in multiple stakeholders, both the private sector and the public sector, in using these systems and being able to transfer information, but ultimately the individuals, the users, the people whose information is being collected, how we're meeting their needs and how we're building systems not to just, as the previous panel was highlighting, not just extract information about these individuals, but identify what their needs are, what their privacy concerns are, and meet them where they are and build systems for that particular objective. I think I'll stop there and take the questions. I know that's a lot. So.
That's great. I'm glad you raised issues like architecture and design. We have always to remember that technology is never neutral. It's exactly the opposite of what we usually hear, because it's the product of design. And when we heard about the case of Tumas and Estonia, how they designed like the X road in order to compartmentalize the data. And these are actually the hard decisions to make. Do you centralize the data? Do you decentralize the data? Do you centralize public services? Do you decentralize them? So these are like actually very hard questions. And I'm glad you raised also the privacy issue, because that's a great point for calling Stephen into the conversation. And I would love to hear more from you about these things.
Thanks. Yes, I'm actually going to talk about two very different issues with digital identities, and privacy is indeed one of them. We have the technology to completely invade people's privacy, to make things completely anonymous or pseudonymous, and we need to, and there probably need to be middle ground. So I'll give you a concrete example. I actually start with 1973, when an advisory committee to the then Cabinet Department of Health, Education, and Welfare issued a really seminal report on privacy. Starting in the 60s, people started worrying about giant computer databases. Technology wasn't quite there yet, but it was very clearly coming. People were worrying about it. What do we do about this? And one of the things that this report strongly said is we must not allow the Social Security number to become the universal identifier for lots of different things, all of which can be linked together by this one unique number. Well, this advice was not heeded, to put it very mildly.
Yeah.
But technology has actually created another unique number. It's the phone number for your phone.
Yeah.
You know, for most people, their phone number is something that they got, you know, when they got their first phone. Your phone up, your area code says, where were you living when you were, say, 10 years old? And it's not going to change because there's no strong reason to change your phone number. And there are lots of legitimate reasons to give your phone number to various places. And there's another, it's called a database key for joining different pieces of data, a centralized sort of thing. Now, we haven't talked about a digital identity card. In some sense, this could be a centralized identity, and that carries advantages, certainly, but it also carries privacy risks. Well, cryptography can do all kinds of amazing tricks. We could say, oh, so let's look at this university. You could have a digital ID card that was provably issued by this university, but you could generate as many sub-identities as you wish that were not linkable to each other, and you could use one to register for this, and another one to go to a concert, and another one to walk into a building that's normally locked. But there are other things where you really need to have one real identity, for example, checking out books from the library so they hope to come after if the book doesn't come back. In a national context, you may say, hey, an anonymous identity is great for registering to vote, make it strongly unlinkable, but you want to make sure that any one person only registers once. So there are a lot of different things. Some of this we know how to do cryptographically, some of which we don't. But it's really bad for the technologists, and I have more than 50 years experience in programming computers. You don't want to let the technologists make this decision based on just what they want or what is convenient. This is a societal decision, a social decision that has to be made. In countries that don't yet have this identity infrastructure, know where things can go and are in a much better position to actually make this decision consciously and perhaps differently. You know, what are the real needs? You know, there might be a real national security need for certain, or public safety need for certain kinds of clearly defined, linkable to one physical person identity, but that doesn't mean that the Amazons, the Walmarts, the other multinationals of the world should be able to track you that way. That doesn't enhance national security nearly as much. Or maybe it does, but this is a decision that should be made consciously and not by the implementers who, you know, no one ever intended phone numbers to be a great database key for linking things. The US government was actually the first, the Social Security Administration was actually the first to start misusing Social Security numbers for a secondary purpose. So you've got to watch for the convenient trap. So that's one point. The other point I want to make is very, very different, and it has to do with how do you establish the identity in the first place or recover from it. How many people here have lost a vital identity document like a passport or driver's license and had to cope with recovering? You know, about 15 years ago, I was in Paris with my wife and son, and my wife's purse was stolen with her passport and her son's passport, and they were flying home the next day. We had to go to, apart from many hours in the ever-lovely 70th arrondissement police station, get an emergency passport the next morning. How do you establish identity? Well, in this case, it was relatively easy. I was there with an American citizen, with my passport. I was staying longer so I could prove my identity. Error recovery like this is not easy. Building up identity in the first place is not easy. How do you establish your identity sufficiently well when you're just starting out or when you've lost everything? Disadvantaged populations are particularly challenged when it comes to this. Think homeless people in this country who might be eligible for example, Social Security, but can't prove their age or identity because they lost all of those documents years ago. There's a couple of articles in the New York Times just in the last couple of weeks about Kenya's national identity system and how some descendants of migrants or ethnically different groups are being marginalized, finding it harder to prove their identity. I will take this as fact. I have no on-the-ground knowledge of this. But it becomes a tool for social control, and it becomes, if not done properly, it excludes a significant portion. How you handle what's called breeder documents, or it's going to be a culturally dependent thing. When I got my first passport while waiting online at the passport office, I noticed a little sign about all the other ways you could prove your identity and date of birth, other than the documents they told you to bring. It included things like affidavits, family Bible, birth records, and so on. There are all these fallback things, but these have to be culturally specific, and you have to make sure you don't exclude people simply because you don't like them or because you didn't appreciate their culture. So when you're building up a system like an identity system, you have to understand, how do you start it? How do you bootstrap it? How do you handle exceptions? I'll give you one more exception and I'll shut up. When my wife was born, her parents had one name, but he became a naturalized citizen when she was about 2 years old and changed her name. There was no paper trail of her name change. When she got her first passport, she did it with affidavits from relatives about this was the name she's always used, from age 2 on up. But at this point, the older generation is gone. If she ever lost these documents, she would have a hell of a hard time reestablishing identity without this paper trail. How do you do it? And she's comfortably middle class, etc.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm glad you raised the Social Security problem, because when we talk about identity, we wanted to make sure what we are talking about. Because one thing is about, for instance, biographic certificates. So it's your birth record, it's your marriage certificate, and so on. This is one thing. IDs is the type of document that proves who you are. That's why you have like your fingerprint on them or other techniques. So it's about establishing an individual. And administrative numbers, like Social Security numbers, is what a government gives to you regarding certain political or policy programs. And there's so much confusion between these terms. And sometimes people take administrative numbers and try to turn them into identities, which is completely dysfunctional. So design is very important, and it's very important to keep it clear about what we're talking about. And design is actually what I would like to raise with you, Katie. Not only design, but also gender issues. I'm sure you're involved with important debates about how to design a good ID and also how to account for gender issues in ID. So, yes.
Great, thank you. So I work with FinEquity, which focuses on women's financial inclusion, and I lead the technology component. It's part of the Consultative Group for Assistance to the Poor, CGAP, at the World Bank Group. And we are a community of around 1,000, I think 1,300 people now, who look at all of the different ways that women are able and not able to access financial resources. And so one thing that we know that in low-income countries, for those people who don't have a bank account and they don't have any form of identity, it's the piece of identity, the paper that's going to stop them from getting a bank account. We know that in low-income countries, 44% of women don't have an identity compared to 28% of men. So it's a real issue. In countries where there are sort of gender norms that are more severe, like Afghanistan, you have a 45% gender gap in digital identity, and only 7% of women have a bank account. So this is pretty, it's hugely effective in terms of what it does for a woman's life to not have a form of identity, not have a bank account. Rules in several countries around actually getting an identity are different for unmarried women as they are for unmarried men. So Saudi Arabia, Oman, again Afghanistan, they have different rules for how you actually get an identity. And so, going back to Aubra's comment, how do we meet the needs of the people who we are trying to give an identity to? I sort of want to flip the question. We talk about digital identity as if it's a technology question. And it is, but it's also about the kind of the social and cultural norms around what identity means, and how you value what you don't necessarily understand. Every 3 years, the World Bank puts out Findex data, which measures the level of financial inclusion globally. And there's been a huge amount of research and data in recent years around India and the India stack, Aadhaar. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. And it's widely lauded as a success. There are obviously some issues, but as a large-scale rollout, now they're sort of saying that 95% plus, I think my colleague here is going to talk further about this, have an identity. And so 2 years ago, the big piece of data that everyone was very excited about was that 80% of Indians now had financial inclusion, had some form of bank account, be it a mobile money account or a normal bank account. But 48% of those accounts were dormant. And so this sort of speaks to a much wider story around what does it actually, what does it actually mean to the individual? How do you make these really abstract concepts mean something, worthwhile? What is the use case that is going to make someone sign up for a digital identity, a bank account, and understanding, what the drivers are and what the barriers are has to go into the design process. It's very easy to design for a specific need, but often the development sector is very guilty of, being a solution in search of a problem. And we need to really pare that back and sort of start understanding not only, what are the needs of what is the person going to use this identity for? Is it that they are a migrant worker and they really see the value in being able to send remittances easily back to their home country? What are the barriers? So, with agricultural workers, they don't necessarily have fingerprints. For women, collecting a face scan or an iris scan might be deeply problematic or have cultural, some negative cultural hang-ups, I guess, or ideas around it in some countries. And so it's really, we need to start thinking about the whole process of identity. For MasterCard are just getting ready to launch a large initiative, and it's heartening to see that they are offering a variety of different biometrics as part of that. And to sort of speak a little bit more about the sort of abstract concept, artifacts. We might talk about identity as a being very comfortable with what it is, but tangible artifacts are very important. I think that they can be very important in explaining a process. They might not be meaningful to us, but they can help the initiative bring meaning to the consumer. And if you don't, when we think about privacy in the last mile, the rural poor, how do you explain that, not only the opportunities of digital identity, but the risks? And are we doing that? Because I think that we try and push the opportunity and tell people, like, look at this great way you can send remittances home, and look at this fantastic way you can have your say in local council. But actually, we need to be very clear about helping people understand the risks. And to do that, we have to understand the risks and what they are in that specific context. So I think, from my perspective, when I think about women's financial inclusion, and the barriers, they are very, very similar to those of women's digital inclusion in the digital identity process. And we need to make sure that we're not putting people at greater risk, we're not giving people a greater burden to manage when we produce these these programs, these initiatives. I'm not going to get into the sort of the details of fatigue around multiple functional systems versus foundational systems, because I know that my colleagues are going to pick up on that. And I am aware that we're running out of time, so I won't go into public-private partnerships at this point. Pick it up later.
It's actually a great topic, and it's a good topic also to raise with Valerie. You're going to talk about some use cases, but we had an interesting conversation before this panel, and we talked about the role of the private sector as well. So one of the dilemmas of governments everywhere is that maybe if they don't establish their own digital identity, there will be a provider, which can be Facebook or others, that will come up with a good enough ID system that can maybe be adopted as a form of universal identity, or at least good enough identity for most services. So what are the use cases that you've been working with, and how do we address the public-private dilemma?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, maybe as a quick introduction, Digital Identity is a non-profit association, and we work in general on digital transformation projects. And obviously, as an association, we have the liberty to put forward principles under which we think any digital transformation has to be done. So I think coming from the digital transformation wording, let me maybe just lift the terminology of digital identity up a little bit. Because I think digital identity is a massively unsexy term. And it generally gives this feeling that it is a technology and that it is, I don't know, a thing in a way. But I have actually recently made a new friend who was telling me about his endeavor to build a barn. And he was showing me a picture of the barn coming up, and I got excited once I saw the walls coming together. And I thought to myself afterwards, I mean, this is exactly where we go wrong, because we should be excited about the foundations. We should be excited when we see the hole in the ground, and we should be excited when we see that being done properly. And the same can be said about digital identity. Digital identity is the foundation to, I think, everything that we have spoken about today already, that we will be talking about in the future. Digital identity is the foundation to the digital economy. It's the foundational to the digital transformation, as we call it. And it's the foundation, I would say, as well, to all the problems that we have just heard about before when we talk about data. Digital identity is the source of personal data. And for that reason as well, I think digital identity is more than just the foundational use case that we keep hearing about, that we've heard before in Estonia as well. It is the basis for every identity that we come across. It is Facebook, it is Amazon, it is all the different types of logins that you're using. And I'm saying that particularly as well because when we talk about development, we get very excited about the ability to lift people out of poverty. We're getting very excited about the ability to connect people, to make them sell their things online. We make them maybe have access to markets. But really, we should be ever so careful when we get involved in that space to do the foundation right. So let me just say a few words about maybe starting with the digital economy. The digital economy is a fantastic opportunity for the development sector. The estimation goes that about 15 to 15% is added to GDP by digital economy. I'm pretty sure that Estonia will have a different number to this. China is estimated to go up to 30%. In many of the countries I've seen across Africa, I would say that number definitely is higher as well. This is the opportunity right now to think about lifting people out of poverty. It is the digital economy that we're talking about. But I think with all the advantages that we're seeing, I would say that we've heard enough today, and I'm probably talking to the right audience as well, to say, don't we feel creepy about it? Don't we feel like it's coming on us, it's watching us, it's tracking us, it's selling us suddenly things that we never wanted. It's just like there is a feeling of discomfort, and I think there were very good questions raised before as well. Yeah, I want to be optimistic about the digital economy, but I've also got to be absolutely negative about much of the things we've seen. And I actually also want to take the opportunity to thank John Patel for the work that was done by his team as well, because I think that's exactly the type of awareness raising that we do need right now. So another word that was mentioned a lot today was trust. And I personally think this word is massively misused at the moment. We're talking about trust as if it's the underlying foundation of everything, and yet we're not really doing anything about it. I think exactly examples like the visualization of where that goes. I mean, we have to sign things because digital becomes so elementary to our life. It's impossible to live without it. And yet we have to sign up to terms and conditions that we don't understand. And even if we were to read them and interpret them, it obviously means something different in reality. So what do we really mean with trust? And let me maybe just lay out a few elements of what I think we should define as trust and what we should look at. And I think what both my colleagues already have, or the three colleagues, sorry, have already picked up on as well. Trust is something very systemic, or it should be addressed in a very systemic way. It's not a technology, for sure it's not a technology. We're talking about laws. And even when we have laws in place, are we accountable? Are we actually putting in the mechanism to really hold people responsible for the wrongdoing? We're talking about institutional arrangements. Do we have mandates allocated? Are the roles and responsibilities clear? Have they been disseminated to people? Does everybody know what that means? We're talking about things like design issues. I mean, what are we going to do about illiterate people? What are we going to do, especially in the African context, about people that speak tribal languages? I've read the other day that Google only allows a handful of languages. How are we going to pick up on these people? We hear about women. How do we include them? These are all design issues. Then we talk about third parties that we bring in. A lot of countries find themselves locked in solutions at the end that they can't get out of. Or I see as well across Africa solutions that, that maybe the private parties deliver on it, but all of a sudden they also collect facial recognition information, which then leaves the country. We see laws where countries are feeling they're feeling the pressure to put something in place. So they're saying, well, we have laws now that demand that the data stays within our country. Well, I don't know, is that a good law? I mean, I can see why they want to do this, but we need to help them to not feel like they need to put these laws into place, but help them to actually put better solutions in place altogether. So I just want to finish by saying, apart from having to address all of this and this needing to be a systemic approach, I do appreciate very much that this is a university. And I think there's a huge role a university can play in this.
Yeah.
I want to also repeat that this is actually a project coming out of the Columbia World Projects. So I'm very excited to see what comes out of this. I hope that colleagues with the appropriate information and the research that's happening already are putting information into this as well. This is not something that I think we should leave governments alone with, and this is not something that we should just let private industry partners solve. This is something that needs to work in partnership, and I think a university has an undeniable, unbiased, and very knowledgeable approach to this. So I very much encourage that work.
Great. And I'm glad you mentioned trust, because one of the reasons we are talking about digital IDs today is because the internet doesn't have an identity layer. There is even debate whether that is a flaw that from the start maybe it should have had. Of course, the repercussions would be huge, like for things like disinformation or when you miss the authorship of what's said in the internet, that has repercussions that are both good and bad. But the fact is, reestablishing this identity layer and the strategies for doing so, I think it's one of the pressing challenges that we have right now. And talking about foundations, I'm going to talk with Professor Anupam right now about Aadhaar, which means precisely foundation in Hindi. So I think it's a good term to start this conversation. Just for the sake of curiosity, first time we collaborated was in the remote year of 1999, in which you wrote an article for a book that I organized then. So it's really great to have you here. So.
And of course, you actually stole my opening statement.
Yes, sorry for that.
So Aadhaar literally means foundation.
Yeah.
So my task here is talk a little bit about the Indian situation, the India stack, which you've kindly teed up as well. So the the president, President Ilves, talks this afternoon about Estonia, a country of 1.3 million people, which he and others have really led to the forefront of the digital economy, largely by building on this foundation of digital identity, right? And so India took this move as well a decade ago, but began by trying to do this kind of colossal task of taking more than 1 billion people and putting them into a national identification system. There was no national identity card or number or anything like that before Aadhaar. So this is kind of created from scratch. And it included not just creating a 12-digit ID and name and address and things like that, but also biometrics, which have been mentioned. So your fingerprint and or an iris scan, which are both quite important biometrics. And as has been pointed out, there are a lot of farmers who have worked their fingers so much that they no longer have fingerprints that are readable on these systems. So this is a fraught exercise, to say the least. But currently, there are 1.2 million people in this, billion, I'm sorry, the number is so large. Yeah. It's literally 1,000 Estonias that are in the Indian digital ID system. Okay. And the idea really is that as the foundation, this is part of the India stack. That is, other services, health services, education services, financial services are all built upon digital ID. So it really becomes the foundation. But I also wanted to pick up another point that Valerie made, which was the alternative of a private sector-led model. And this goes back to John Battelle as well, and his incredibly important work. So Facebook really, so as Ronaldo has pointed out, the internet did not come with an identity layer. That was part of the design of the internet. But other people, businesses realize identity is really important, it's critical. This is why cookies are placed every time you move anywhere on the internet. They want to know exactly what you're doing, and it makes their provision of services easier to you, but it also makes their relationship with you much more lucrative, right? So Facebook has long sought to be that identity layer. So Facebook wants to be the single check-in point for everyone else on the internet. So essentially, deep at the heart of the internet, everything you do is Facebook. Because Facebook has long had a real name system, a real identification system. Once we've paired you with a Facebook identity, then we can populate you for everything else. That's been Mark Zuckerberg's kind of part of his vision to build. So Facebook is the internet essentially at the deep level. And this is what leads to Cambridge Analytica, and so Facebook's desire to be the critical foundation and to be valuable to other enterprises in that way is what leads to this API problem. And so the main issue, one of the key critical questions in this context, Stephen has raised as well, is the level at which the database is able to be exploited and to be abused. And so this then depends upon how the API functions, upon the very granular questions about, is the actual ID shared or a hash of the ID or some kind of virtual token, a virtual ID, which replaces the actual number. So instead of sharing your social security number, you share something which is a mimic of that number, which it can still be authenticated, as Stephen has pointed out. So the system can authenticate you without actually giving the key biometric or other information away. And so I think if you're coming late to the game, it's actually not a bad place to be. And so you have no legacy system to worry about. You can now think through these problems from the start. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm very glad to see folks like Steve and my colleagues here working on it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Estonia's model was designed around like maybe 8 years ago, 10 years ago. India's 20 years ago. India's was like 12 years ago or so, right? My question would be, how would you design from scratch a digital ID system right now? Would you move into the direction of a self-sovereign identity, completely distributed, one in which the state could not touch or revoke because it would be only up to the citizen to basically manage that particular ID? So how would you do that? Do you guys have any ideas about how would you design a digital ID system right now?
Well, it's very far from clear that it's actually desirable to have any one solution, Mark Zuckerberg notwithstanding. As you pointed out, other academic writings have pointed out, people have multiple identities, and it's often very desirable to keep them separate. You know, so I've been using Twitter far too actively for a fair number of years, and a few months ago I set up a completely separate Twitter account just for my photography. I'm not trying to keep it anonymous. I mean, my real name is associated with that account, but for people who only want to know what I think about photography and not about technology or politics, they can just follow that account. I am someone different socially than I am professionally. There's not a strong reason to have only one identity, and a lot of reasons not even nefarious reasons. It's just that who you are. You know, I'm going to be speaking for a government body on Tuesday, and a little asterisk, affiliation listed for identification purpose only. Well, I got to put that in, but really they want to go decouple it. The university does not stand behind what I say. Matters less at a university than when I was in the private sector, working for a private company that might actually care that my name was identified that way. There's a whole pile of different issues. And it's not clear you really want one identity. Even apart from privacy concerns, and I do have grave privacy concerns, but you are just different people in different situations.
Yeah, Aubra.
So I would jump in on the how would you design an ID system today by saying I think it would be wonderful to hear great ideas pop up from this room. We were talking about this over lunch today. I think the idea of self-sovereign ID is a fascinating one, and I see a lot of potential there. I think having an identity that accompanies you wherever you go, there's no intermediary that you depend on, there's no node where you must trust a central government authority. I think all of those things are very compelling when you think about issues like human trafficking or forced child marriage. The importance of having an identity that no one can take away from you is just so paramount. That said, and this is what we were talking about at lunch, I have yet to see, and maybe this is just my own limited creativity, but I have yet to see a truly inclusive, self-sovereign template where those who are not digitally literate, those who do not understand implications of loss of your personal data, would be truly empowered to gain from having that ID. And I think that's not to say that we shouldn't aspire to that. I think we absolutely should re-envision what identity can look like, but the caveat I would put to that is it should be identity for all. And that's speaking from the perspective of USAID, but also just as a human being. I think when we talk about a futuristic, self-sovereign state of identification where portability and all that is ingrained, I think there's often an assumption that the user will be of a certain caliber of understanding or of kind of a certain type of archetype that we should not always make the assumption around.
And related to that question, how do we make digital identity systems politically resilient in the sense that Estonia had a great president, but what if in the future it elects like a malicious president or one aligned with the Russia or something like that? How do we make sure that the checks and balances are architecturally built into the system? Not sure if you would think about that.
I
there is one component to a digital identity solution, and I think to any solution that incorporates multiple users, owners, stakeholders of some sort, and that is a governance structure. And I think we've heard before as well that we need a new governance structure. The same can be said about identity solutions. Identity solutions are massively dependent on a solid governance structure. I have seen some fantastic, and maybe I think on this as well, I just want to throw in, when I think of a good digital identity system, I really think of it as a modular system. I think it needs to be always extremely flexible. And I've seen components of very good digital identity systems across the globe, but I would say none of them is perfect. So I think the idea is let's take those different components, let's put it together, but at the top of all of this sits a governance structure. And that's right. I mean, what if Estonia suddenly were to have a, let's say, a Russian leader or someone who, I don't know exactly, so maybe
I'll knock on the table on your behalf.
Well, okay, but what, so then, I mean, let's say, what if Russia was going to have suddenly a leader that they didn't want? What if it was a leader that does not necessarily represent the needs and interests of the citizens? And I'm sure some countries might relate to this at the moment.
I know a certain country that I come from.
I mean, look, I grew up in Germany. Definitely, this has happened. And systems can be abused. So how do we make sure that this doesn't happen? Apart from a modular system, I think it is that governance that is the core to it. So we keep talking about distributed technologies. I think we really need to dig into the distributed governance as well and how that can play out. How do you not have one party, one leader that actually can turn and twist the button, but a bigger amount of people? I mean, we're not necessarily anymore living in a world that's made up by countries as well. What if we were to give that type of ownership as well to partners that we really trust?
Yeah. So I think that emphasizes the need for a multi-stakeholder approach. So identities are not only something that pertains to the government, but it pertains to the scientific community, to the third sector, to the private sector, and the more you have those constituencies actually in a governance structure, it feels to me that you might have better decisions rather than just taking them unilaterally or with partial information. With that said, what about privacy issues and also ownership of data? Should we centralize data? Should we decentralize data? What are the approaches that we should take into account?
I mean, I think regardless of whether you centralize data or decentralize data, one of the key pieces around privacy is, I know the pieces of my data personally that I want to keep private, and I have a sense of how to do that. But if you don't know that something is valuable, how do you protect it? And I think that so much of the work that we're doing in emerging markets and development is working with people who don't necessarily have a concept of why this data is valuable, and that's very risky because if I don't know that I'm not an American citizen, I have a social security number. If I don't know that I'm not supposed to share that, then it's risky, right? And you do have in many countries very low levels of digital literacy. I've talked to lots of people in countries like Papua New Guinea or Myanmar, where I've looked at their internet usage and whatnot, or chatted to them about their internet usage. They don't use the internet. I don't know. What about this? Oh, that's Facebook. I only use Facebook. I've never used the internet. I go to Facebook, and that's where I search for people. That's where I shop. That's where I search for local restaurants, or that's my news feed. It's a one-stop shop. And why would I be worried about that? I have no sense of the risk around that. And so I think before you even get to the sort of the architecture of that privacy and where the data is housed, you need to really pull it back to the user level and look at what that actually means and how abstract these concepts are to people who are used to putting their money under their mattress or burying it in the garden because, you know, what is tangible exists, and the idea of putting it in a bank, very, very, very risky. The idea of putting it on their mobile phone, bananas. You know, the idea of suddenly being paid in Bitcoin. I mean, you're taking them from here to here without explaining any piece of the journey. And, you know, the same applies with identity. We need to be very, very careful. People hang on to these paper cards we give them. They mean everything. They lose the paper card and they don't have a semblance or a sense that behind the scenes all of this data is there. I'm sure, you know, you can sort of talk to some great examples from Aadhaar and, you know, what happens at the last mile.
This is actually a great point, because on one side we have amazing technology like zero knowledge proof cryptography that in theory assures like an interesting model for identities, but on the other side you might have not only the absence of digital literacy, but you might have the absence of literacy in itself, which is the reality of countries like Brazil, India, and others. So how Aadhaar was introduced, and what are the cultural challenges and anthropological issues that emerge?
So biometrics were largely because of illiteracy. You could, you know, you don't have to sign your name. You could just use your fingerprint, right? That was the general. That was the origin of introducing biometrics into this Aadhaar system. And so, but I think in general, the issues of privacy rights, India, you know, even though it had Aadhaar for a decade, is now putting together a privacy law. And so it's been very late to the game of actually creating a substantial, omnibus privacy regime. It's actually very robust. I mean, I think there's reasons to criticize it, et cetera, but we can criticize any privacy law in the world. But it's a substantial improvement to what existed before. So I think that, so the one thing I worry about in privacy contexts is notions of ownership of data. A lot of scholars like me feel that that actually is unlikely to prove very useful. Ownership, so Facebook right now says you own your data. All the companies say you own your data, but it really has no meaning because you've licensed your data to them perpetually throughout the universe in whatever form, right? And so, as long as you have alienability, ownership is not particularly important because, I mean, especially because if the valuation of data is very fraught. And so people will alienate the data very quickly. So I think it really has to do with governance, the exact kinds of rights and regimes that you have, but I don't think it's ownership and a kind of libertarian vision of this as property that will solve the problems.
I will very much agree with that. Data is not property. I will say that for all that I'm a privacy scholar and technologist, I don't think I have a good handle on what data about me is floating around out there. A few years ago, I got quite a shock. I had to go set up an account with some firm which really needed I had no prior relationship with them. They need a fairly strong notion of my identity. And they resorted to something called knowledge-based authentication. They dipped into data held by some of the large data brokers and asked me a bunch of questions that they thought that only I would know. The most surprising one was, which of these companies have you worked for? But one of the companies they listed was a small, obscure startup founded by a friend of mine. They had the relationship between me and him, and that he had founded the startup, and that I would know. And I thought that was a remarkable display of how the hell did they get that in machine-readable, machine-parsable form.
Yeah, very good. Let me take questions from the audience. I think it's about time we did that. Do we have a microphone here? Excellent. Please.
Thanks, Orlando. Niall Mclennan from the United Nations. I'm known to some of the colleagues here. I have enormous respect for everybody on this panel. This is a fascinating topic. It's one, however, as you can see over the years, my hair has been pulled out on matters related to terminology, on matters related to some basic concepts. So let me start off by saying something I think controversial, but to really clarify things, right? It is the utopian dream of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, every terrorist and criminal network in the world for digital identity systems that are not linked to the core legal identity system that at the heart of which is birth registration. And here's where I have to disagree with you. Birth registration is the gold standard of identity. It is not simply an event. It is the establishment of identity. And from birth registration, that identity should follow the person from birth all the way through life to death. Nobody should be able to turn up in any country, including in Estonia, as an adult and simply reinvent themselves and say, completely invent a new name, a new identity, a new birth date, a new citizenship on the basis of self-identity. It has to be linked all the way back to a legal system that starts at birth. So we have to be clear about that. And I think also the idea that I am Niall McCann to DMV, I'm John Smith to Social Security, I'm another name to passport control, that I have 5 or 6 different legal identities issuing different documents, that is a dystopian nightmare to think about. You have to have, we can have 1,000 different identities, 1,000 different digital identities, but we can only have one legal identity, the real you, and it is on the basis of that identity that your rights as a citizen, as a human being, in terms of voting rights, citizenship rights, rights to welfare, education, health, that's the identity, one and only one, that we must establish our rights from.
I think that's it's a really good point, Niall, and I think you have every reason to be putting that onto the table, because I think quite often we neglect to talk about the importance of CRVS or birth registration. I do think that the lines become a little more blurry when you think about other ways that we leverage identity in day-to-day operations. For example, for USAID or for other partners that we work with, when you are going to, for example, identify whether someone is creditworthy, I don't need to know that they are John Smith or Niall McCann. I need to know their behavioral patterns that predict whether they can repay a loan. And so quite often we'll partner with organizations that they don't need that level of assurance for the types of things that I would think of as being fundamental, whether someone gets a loan, whether someone gets crop insurance. And so I think there's this kind of gradation between the fundamental legal ability to do X, Y, and Z, vote, receive, the land title, things that need to be in that legal domain, versus some of the activities that sometimes are in the legal domain, but often blur the lines. Yeah.
Any other comments on this issue?
Maybe just one small one. I think the beauty will lie in options. Specifically right now in the UK, there are a lot of people desperate to prove that there's some heritage in their family that allows them to keep the EU passport. There are multiple, especially unfortunately for people that come from Ireland, there are reasons why these birth certificates have gone lost. I'm not going to go into that, but there are reasons why people lose that. And then that's not just because I lose it myself, it's because it was taken from you. And I think in order to re-establish yourself, talking about inclusion, making this possible for everybody, we need to talk about options. We need to be able as well to put things together that we have that equally justify. And just very briefly, in Nigeria, for example, if you have nothing, which is very often the case, Nigeria is one of the countries which I think has a coverage of about 5% of legal identities. So how do you identify yourself? They tend to go to notaries. They go with maybe their father and their brother. They confirm that I am who I am, and that's how they get it. So we need to have options for where there is a gap in the system.
Yeah, very good point.
I would add one
Yep, please, Stephen.
I worry when there's too much power given to a government, when the government goes bad. Disenfranchising Jews, Roma, dissidents, people, disfavored political party or ethnic group or what have you. We have seen too many examples of this in all too recent history. And if you suddenly become a non-person because your digital ID has been canceled, you're in very big trouble if too much is riding on that.
more of that starts to, affect your credit history, I mean, it gets incredibly messy. I agree there has to be options. I don't have the answers as to how it's done.
Good. Questions? We have one in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Valerie, you made an interesting comment. We have distributed technology. We need to start getting distributed governments or something like that, you said. Can you be more specific about what that looks like?
Well, put me on the spot. I mean, I'm not, I mean, I won't be able to go into the actual technical logic of it, but, and plus I do think that every solution needs to be looked at case by case. There will be multiple variations to this, and especially when we talk in the development sector, there will be, for example, countries that, like, you don't want to give them too much power, so who can you bring in? Let me maybe just give you one example. One example that I particularly am interested in, and I think it's got something quite to it, is the way the UK is approaching its identity system. And this is on the basis of, there is not a one-off as such, there's an ability to put an ID together on the basis of 50,000 options, which I think is very smart. It draws on the institutions that exist in the system already, the post office, the bank, and so on. I think we've seen that as well in Scandinavian countries, particularly and across, I think, Estonia, as well as the option to bring in the banking system and other like trusted service providers that can help build that solution. But then, if I look at the UK system in particular, it suddenly all comes together in what they call the hub. And that's the area where it all gets blurred and it all gets taken out. And that's the attack. That's the point of attack, if you want. Because that's one decision process now. All the policy suddenly sits within that one box. And I think that's where we have to go in and address the issue of distributed governance. Now, who should all be included in that governance? I mean, it needs to be some sort of partnership, but the technology behind it will probably draw on what we now know about distributed technologies.
We have a question from President Yves.
You have to go beyond identity. In fact, the reason why my number and the Bürgerkarte in Deutschland are not working to any degree is that you have an identity, but you can be Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer there. You call yourself that. You have to be connected, you must be connected to a citizen registry that is a certificate authority, a certificate issuing authority. Unless you do that, you will not have any digital government. The problem is that in the United States, for one reason, for Germany, for other reasons, Japan, third reasons, they do not make that connection. And so you never will get to the point of building up services because you cannot identify yourself digitally. Yes, you can go across the border, and now in Europe, in the Schengen zone, you just show your ID and that's fine, and everyone says, wonderful. You cannot do anything that is secure because there is no certificate issuing authority. So it is more than simply having an ID. The ID must be matched to something that can then certify you are you and then allow you access to services or do whatever you want to do. But I mean, the problem with this is that, I think there's too much focusing on identity without the infrastructure, which for anything effective will require a broad certificate issuing authority for any services.
Can I just quickly react to this? And I
Yes,
think that
please.
actually brings up something that we haven't spoken about yet, and I do think that is very important, is the federated idea of it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that very much applies to Europe, and it very much applies to Africa as well. And that's maybe not so much, I don't know enough about the US system, but you might have like one way of moving about, whereas in Europe, you're crossing borders and you suddenly are in different jurisdictions. And the same, of course, applies to Africa as well. And I think the concept of trying to find a way that we can cross these borders and still, you were talking about the Finnish-Estonian relationship, I think things like this should absolutely enter the discussion, because whatever I trust or whatever I establish in my own country, in this modern global world, is just not going to be enough.
Right. Comments on that? Yes, please.
it's not just who issues the certificate, who certifies your identity. That's certainly a very important part of it. You know, at what level the world has that with passports, you know. Approximately 200 entities can issue passports that vouch for identity to the satisfaction of that country. And you know who issued it, you know, and you can decide whether or not you want to accept it. But there's another piece to it, and that is what technologically we call the authorization. What you are allowed, what this identity is allowed to do. And there are other ways to do things where you receive an authorization credential which is independent of identity. A dollar bill does not require me to show my identity. A physical key is not bound to my identity. There are advantages and disadvantages to schemes like this, but when you try to look at it holistically, maybe this is the sort of thing that there is a place for, especially for privacy reasons. I think President Lewis has a response to that.
Very good.
Well, things are moving slowly.
Oops. Let's try it again.
Yeah, things are moving slowly. I mean, you have the ADOS directive in the European Union, which says that every country must issue or allow citizens of another EU country all the same digital services it offers its own citizen. The biggest loser in this is Estonia. The greatest winner of this would be Greece if they had an ID, but they don't. But Spain, for example, which allows no services. The goal should be, at least I see in Europe, is that not only digital prescriptions, but also health records, would be that if I get sick in Greece, I authorize the doctor, he gets to look at my medical records, he gets my medical records already translated into Greek, because he obviously would not know Estonian. But the point is that you can do all these things, unfortunately, and you can do all these things today. There is no technological barrier to anything. The barriers are all political, and they probably will remain there for the next 30 years. So, I mean, but the technology is all there. And you can extend this, you can go beyond the Schengen zone, you can include, well, or in the Schengen zone, include the Norwegians. Ultimately, you can do it, you know, I mean, theoretically, you can have digital prescriptions that work in the United States and vice versa. All of this is possible, but you need to have a certification issuing authority, you need the authorization procedures to access data. All of that is simply non-existent. So that's where we are. On the other hand, on just to the other point here, on identity and having multiple identities, you know what the big problem in espionage today is? Facebook. Because you don't have a history anymore. I mean, if you used to be in the old days, you'd go and find some person who died at age 3 and assume that identity. You can't do that anymore, because where have you been? You've not been on Facebook. There are no records of you. And so this is the new problem of espionage.
We are going to our final stretch. Let me take a few questions very quickly. I'll take one here, one there, one there. 4 questions, and then we can wrap up. Just make it short, please.
Thank you. Greg Shatton. I participate in ICANN activities, and this conversation is giving me flashbacks to the effect of GDPR on who is, which brings up much larger issues of the effect of data protection laws on any type of identity, accreditation, validation. I think the data protection laws are moving exactly away from everything this discussion has taken place. And if you want a case study, look at the attempts that are being made right now in the expedited data policy development group at ICANN to try to create a validation accreditation system for third parties to get who is data. In other words, to find out who owns the domain name. 30 people have spent thousands of hours trying to think about this and biting each other's necks open because the social activists, the intellectual property, and it's made 10 times harder because it's not multilateral. They're trying to do this in the private sector. The only way to do this under current law would be is entirely multilateral. Try to do it in the private sector, you'd just die trying.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
I'm Joyce Searles, and I'm a trustee of the Sovereign Foundation. And I would like to mention about, I take the point that this isn't going to happen quickly, that's for sure, but that things need to be done slowly and can be done slowly if it's sort of a one-off kind of approach. So that's what I like about distributed identity solutions, or they're often called self-sovereign, but self-sovereign is not because I say I am who I am. It's just that in the same way that I have a wallet with 10 cards in it, that I can present the card that is needed for the situation. It doesn't mean I make up the card in my back office and give you my driver's license that I made up. So it's about having the ability to use your individual identifiers. So my thought is that for decentralized identity as a way to get started, because all the problems that have been brought up on this panel, it's as if we could wave a magic wand and say it's now 50 years from now and it'll all be being done the same way or in an interoperable way. I think what we really need to do is figure out what are some things that can be done right now, and decentralized, and particularly with governance. I mean, that's one thing I like about the sovereign ledger is it's heavy on governance. So it's just a matter of getting started with it and not trying to solve every single problem, because human trafficking is a huge problem, and everything that is in the world of humans are big problems, but it can't all be solved with digital identity like overnight. So my thought is that we could get started doing something in the same way that Estonia got started.
Thank you, Joyce. Glad to have you and Doc with us. Tomorrow, yes, last two.
Hi, I'm V. Pratap. I'm a second-year student at SIPA. I really enjoyed the points that both Valerie and Professor Bellovin brought up, as well as the gentleman from the UN. I'm just wondering whether there's a need to change digital identities from being based less on nationality and more on just the basic factor of being human. So just to elaborate more on that, you were talking about countries that have problematic leaders. Right now in India, we have Prime Minister Modi, who is very actively pursuing a policy to disenfranchise and persecute Muslims and other religious minorities. In the event that that was to happen and they was to be stripped of citizenship or any other basic right, should we not be focusing more on having a digital identity that just simply identifies you of being a human, and that may be even easier to implement internationally as well?
Very good. Last question.
Yeah, well, I'll say that, just to respond, the technical issue is what President Ilves said.
Can I ask you just to hold your answer so that we do one final wrap-up?
Okay.
So yeah, let's do that.
I'll be quick. So a couple of times it's come up, including the last question, what happens if a bad government has access to this data? But what hasn't been brought up is what if another country gains access to this data? In 2017, there was a massive data breach of the Aadhaar database. 1.2 billion sets of 10 fingerprints and iris scans, presumably now residing in the databases of Russia, China, the US, and Israel, and that will affect the national security of the country of India for the next 50 or 60 years until all adults are dead in India. Now, that is the difficulty of securing this data for so long against such advanced persistent adversaries is basically impossible. Isn't this a strong argument against such systems?
Depends on the architecture. I hear from President Ilves. So let's do a final wrap-up, and let me start with you, Stephen.
Yeah, these risks from Aadhaar were known. India was warned about this in advance, about the privacy risks, about compromise. No privacy person, no security, computer security person was the least bit surprised that this happened. And yes, it's a risk. There are identity systems that are more resilient against this sort of thing, but they have other disadvantages, like when you need to have the one true identity to vote, to collect social benefits, or what have you. But, you know, as President Ilves pointed out, at some point, someone's got to go certify for the identity. You know, about 200 countries in the UN, 200 certification authorities, and they can delegate to states or provinces if they want. And the question is, how do you get a new one recognized when a group has been systematically disenfranchised? This is a real problem. It is a serious problem. And I don't really know what to do about it.
I'll add on very helpfully. I also don't know what to do about it. I think you've hit on one of the key things that we at USAID are grappling with, which is the tension of protection of very sensitive information. When we're working with governments or designing our own systems, we want to make sure that breaches like that are not possible. They will always be possible, though. And so what steps can you take to encrypt the data, ensure that there is no honeypot of information that's a target for malicious actors? But you always have to balance that, and it's very hard for me as a privacy advocate. You always have to balance that with the utility that having these systems in place brings to the least advantaged of us, right? And so having an identification document, some people will make the calculation that that's worth the risk that might be borne out by these data systems. And I think that's one thing that we can afford to give a lot more attention to, better quantifying the perspectives of the individuals that have to make that calculation ultimately. It could be that the people whose information was in this huge database were willing to have their biometrics at risk like this because it allowed them to get the subsidies that they desperately needed. Your face is basically what my face does whenever I have this argument with colleagues, but I think there's definitely this utilitarian approach that you can either let perfect be the enemy of the good, construct systems that are bulletproof and that would never allow for a breach, or you can take these risks and try and figure it out as we go. What are the steps that we can build in that at least inhibit some of these more egregious breaches, right? And I think that's the balance that we all want to strike. And it's just a question of having these types of dialogues and trying to share what's worked and what hasn't. Yep.
Great. Katie.
Yeah, I'll just note to the gentleman in the front. I mean, again, I think there's a lot of validity in what you say. It obviously strikes horror into the hearts of many people who work for international governments or who are more focused on the state as a center of identity. But to Aubra's point, we do need to be utilitarian about this. When I think about the most vulnerable and what it could allow them, and not only, I mean, of course, there are cash transfer systems that serve the vulnerable, but what we don't account for is the time and energy and effort that goes into these processes. And so there's kind of like this singular identity that's not based on any nationality. It's worth having that conversation. It is worth having that debate. There are sort of certainly negative, there are negative possibilities that would come out of it, but there are also, huge advantages to just having this one system that could then be tied into a national system.
Good. Valerie?
So maybe starting with I think you called it, did you call it the human ID? I don't know, maybe I'm making this up.
I didn't label it.
Okay, all right, so the ID that goes beyond national borders. I mean, I think we have that. Facebook is a global ID, if you want it. Amazon is a global ID. I mean, all these private industry IDs are global. We've just not done it right. So I think we need to think along these lines of saying, it comes back to the idea of having multiple identities. It comes back to the definition between a legal identity, a foundational identity, and all the many functional identities. And I think it's really a combination of the many that will probably give you the right privacy that you want, but we really have to start avoiding the wrong ones. And I think with this, I also want to address the point about the urgency. I mean, I do feel there's a massive urgency. And this is coming to the point as well of the data theft or the data breaches that we see. I mean, this is not just India. If I was an evil person, I'd probably want to get my hand on the Experian. Is it Experian?
Equifax.
Yes. Equifax, exactly, sorry, yes. Data breach, because all of a sudden I could bring down the entire banking system in the US. I mean, we've done all of this already. This is at utmost urgency. The point, however, I want to say around how to do this, we have done identities for many years. I have watched many identities, and I've analyzed many identity systems as well, that have failed. And we're wasting a lot of time, we're wasting a lot of money because we rush into these solutions. We get excited about technologies, or we get excited about something else. And then we end up with a mess that undoing is harder than having not even started. So I think this is urgent, but we need to do it properly. We need to address exactly the needs that are being expressed by the people, and I think something that isn't just owned by my government is one need that is expressed multiple times, but it needs to be done properly. So that's really all I want to say, and I just want to I think somebody was holding up the phone saying before, this is here. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. We are so digitally connected. This has arrived. This is not going to go away. So let's just do it properly now.
Great.
So I think that's exactly right. So Valerie points out that this is here, and I think whether it's done by the public sector or the private sector, it's happening. Digital ID is critical to what people do. Companies need to know who they're dealing with. Governments need to know whom they're dealing with. You need to know whom you're dealing with. So identification is a key part of life. Now that said, I'm glad there isn't an identity layer in the internet, that all humans aren't connected, and everything that we do is not then connected by human ID, because that would also be problematic, because as we know, anonymity is also critical to free speech, free expression, even more so in countries in which, including the United States, in which you might be targeted for your speech. So I think that's, but I also just want to emphasize, the scope of the breach, the Aadhaar breach. I think there's some questions exactly what is, so I don't want to take the representation exactly as it's been made, but I'll leave that to the side. We know that Equifax, through the FTC settlement, is about 140 million people, social security numbers, et cetera, names, et cetera. So Equifax's breach, the OPM breach of the federal government employees, enormous. All 6 million or so people in the Israeli voting records, about a week or two ago, and so at least that's the possible scope of the breach. So these things are being breached. Encryption, of course, is the key tool to make, breach doesn't matter if you can't read the stuff that you just accessed. So I think it's true. But essentially, this is happening. We need to be thoughtful about this, and I think it has tremendous value. So I think it is a huge, basis upon which it would build financial inclusion, and I think and other kinds of inclusion in society.
It's great. So let me thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. It was a great panel. Thanks for bearing with us until this time. So, Dean Merritt Channel.